Hi there, and welcome once again to the Joe Roberts podcast. And this is part 2 of me talking about the Olympic boxing gender debate. As I said, people are lumping differences in sexual development or intersex people in with transgenderism, and there are even some intersex people doing this, and I understand why they're doing it. That's something that I may talk about in another podcast, but it's a mistake, and I'll explain why it's a mistake. These are two entirely different things, okay? A person, if we're going by the strict definition here, a person who is transgender is somebody who is born into the binary. They are born either a biological male or a biological female, and they surgically transition from male to female or from female to male. An intersex person is a person who is born with an amalgamation of primary and secondary sex characteristics which are an amalgamation of male and female. These are two entirely different things, and unlike some intersex people, and I've explained that I know why they're doing this, unlike some intersex people, I am not prepared to sort of support the illusion that an intersex person can be transgender. I do not support that. I will be happy to explain why I don't believe that is a thing in another podcast, but for just now I'll stick to the topic at hand. They are two separate things. There are instances where there have been people throughout history who have intersex conditions, who have differences in sexual development, who go on to call themselves transgender. One example of this was April Ashley. April Ashley had Klinefelter syndrome and later referred to herself as Britain's first trans woman. I don't really feel comfortable with that. I don't really agree with it, and I think that once again it's part of a sustained effort to try and delete the existence of androgyny from our society. I feel that it's part of a sustained effort to try and delete the existence of intersex people and to try and push androgyny back into the collective unconsciousness with shame and dishonesty. And this brings me to the next issue with the article that I read at the start of this podcast. They gave a very weird explanation of what differences in sexual development are. I will reread the paragraph. Khalif was born female but reportedly has differences of sexual development, DSD, a rare medical condition that results in varying genes, hormones and reproductive organs. I am actually witnessing this issue being pushed back into the collective unconscious. That is one of the worst explanations of this characteristic that I have ever heard in my entire life. Firstly, she has a difference in sexual development. We don't know what difference because she won't come out and tell people what it is, and she won't talk about it, which is not helping the issue. But secondly, it's not one medical condition. Differences in sexual development is not a medical condition in and of itself. Differences in sexual development is a term that is used to describe over 30 medical conditions. The unifying characteristic of which is that the person is an amalgamation of male and female sex characteristics, or has sex characteristics which are not typically male or typically female. That is the definition of differences in sexual development. This article is making out that differences in sexual development is one medical condition. This is why I am of the opinion that somewhere in society there has been some sort of sustained effort, or there is some sort of effort being made to suppress this. It may be unconscious, but as somebody who is very much conscious of this issue, I am literally witnessing this issue being pushed down into the collective unconscious. And with paragraphs like that and shoddy journalism like that, it's hardly surprising. Differences in sexual development describes over 30 conditions which people in our society never talk about. That is part of the problem. Biological androgyny exists. Androgyny exists. It exists in naturally occurring form. Intersex people are an expression of that. They're perhaps the most acute expression of that. A sustained effort is being made to obfuscate that fact. And I'm sorry to have to say this, but the transgender thing doesn't help. At the same time, the intersex activists have made a sustained effort to try and raise awareness of the fact that surgeries are forced upon people like myself, people who are biologically androgynous. There has been almost psychotic drive to normalise the idea of carrying out surgeries on adults, young people, and in some cases even children to correct an apparent or alleged incongruence between that person's body and that person's quote-unquote gender identity. And the fact that that enormous drive to normalise this idea of having surgery to correct this apparent incongruence has done, in my opinion, very real damage to the entire sphere of intersex activism, and it seems that I am watching that entire thing slowly die before my eyes. Not that it was ever a particularly huge thing to begin with, and that alongside the persistent and quite baffling attempt to continually blend those two entirely separate things is doing enormous damage to the visibility of people like myself and the awareness of this issue. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about the actual issue itself of an alleged biological male fighting against a biological woman in a boxing ring. Firstly, it's a violent sport, so if you don't want to get hit hard, you shouldn't be doing it. However, I agree that it would be a massive problem if a biological male, an unambiguously biological male, was being placed in a boxing ring with a biological woman. However, I've already said that's not the case. Until we know what difference in sexual development it is that this person has, we can't assess further how appropriate or inappropriate it is for them to be competing in that sport. However, I do have a few more things to say on that issue. It is not a straightforward, clear-cut issue that if somebody has male chromosomes, they should not be competing against biological women in sport, and I will briefly explain why that is the case. I will use two examples. So the first example is complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. Now, a person who has complete AIS is technically a biological male. They have male chromosomes, XY. However, somebody who has that condition also has androgen receptors which do not process androgens properly. So to cut a long story short, they will actually have less testosterone, less androgen, or less androgen being processed in their body than the average biological woman. In short, they are no different to a biological woman when competing in women's sports. They are not at an advantage in any way, shape or form, and very often, and I've met many individuals with complete AIS, their physical proportions are no different to that of the average biological woman. Conversely, you could take an individual who has polycystic ovary syndrome, who technically is a biological woman and who has XX chromosomes, and if you were to put them in certain competitive sports against a biological woman, they would have an advantage. They have a testosterone level which is vastly higher than that of the average woman, and yet they are considered to be a biological woman. This point proves that the issue is not black and white. It has to be assessed on a case-by-case basis, and when I say case-by-case, I mean intersex condition and on an individual basis. When people like this come up in sports against biological women, it has to be assessed on a case-by-case basis, depending upon them as an individual and the difference in sexual development that they have, and there are over 30 of them. I am not talking about transgender athletes. I am talking about athletes who have differences in sexual development. They are not the same thing. So, I've spoken quite a bit about this issue, and as you can probably tell, it's something which I'm quite passionate about, but I really am quite tired and quite frustrated by consistently hearing this issue being totally and utterly misrepresented in society by virtually everybody. I can honestly say by this point, and when it comes to the subject of gender ideology, androgyny, all of that stuff, my level of awareness is incredibly high, and I can honestly say that the awareness where this issue is concerned is actually deteriorating seemingly by the month. Our society, its relationship with gender and so-called gender identity is, I have to say, quite unhealthy in many cases, and it seems to be getting more so, and this issue is increasingly polarising people in society, and it's very sad, especially when there are people like myself who are in an excellent position to provide people with a bit of awareness on the issue and give people a bit of insight into this issue, and it's very, very difficult for someone like myself to actually be listened to when talking about this, and instead we have a whole bunch of uninformed talking heads being given media coverage and having the media spotlight shone on them as they just basically support old cliches and the prevailing orthodoxy on this issue and are not bringing anything new to the table. So that's basically everything that I have to say about this issue. Thank you very much for listening. Bye for now.